Welcome everyone to our webinar, our Monday webinar series. I'm Katherine Lucero, and I'm the Director of the Office of Youth and Community Restoration. It's my honor to be a host today and to welcome colleagues, fellow juvenile justice champions, and friends. Thank you for joining OYCR and our special guests today to continue our webinar series to enlighten, educate, and to promote and partner around critical issues that impact the well-being of youth and communities during this period of realignment and the opportunity of this time in the history of California to get the juvenile justice policy progress right. OYCR provides TA in a variety of ways, and this webinar series is one of them. OYCR leadership is paramount around restorative justice and victim services and how systems partner can identify best practices to improve outcomes for both victims and youth. We have dedicated staff at OYCR dedicated to create and manage a restorative justice advisory board, which currently includes a work group of well-respected and influential community-based organizations. Hearing from harmed individuals during the court process and the process of youth rehabilitation and family and community mending is woven into the vision and mission of OYCR and provides the most holistic healing process for both people and communities. We believe it falls into the community restoration part of our name and is consistent with the spirit of AB 60, which you will hear more about today. At this time, I want to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, retired probation chief Scott McDonald. Scott, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Director. Well, it's my honor to, in turn, introduce our two speakers, starting with Lenore Anderson, who is the founder and president of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, one of the largest justice and public safety reform advocacy organizations in the country. Its flagship program, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, is the nation's largest network of crime survivors advocating for new public safety policies and expanded support for victims. Today, Lenore will discuss this work as well as her book, In Their Names, Victims' Rights, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of Public Safety. Lenore is an attorney who previously served as the Chief of Policy and Chief of the Alternative Programs Division at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, Director of Public Safety for the Oakland Mayor, and as Director of the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where she oversaw the city's violence prevention programs. She's a member of the California Health and Human Services Agency's Behavioral Health Task Force. She holds a JD from NYU School of Law and a BA from UC Berkeley and lives with her family in Oakland, California. I'm also honored to introduce our other speaker, Oswald Thomas. Oswald is the Vice President of Alliance for Safety and Justice and the National Director of the Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice program, which he joined in 2015 to build the Survivors National Network. He has trained thousands and mobilized hundreds of thousands of victims to advocate for access to victim compensation and victim assistance. He's also created trauma recovery centers for victims and has advocated for smarter justice policies that focus more on healing trauma over incarceration. He holds a master's in social work from the University of Connecticut and lives in Atlanta, Georgia with his family. So before we start with the speakers, we want to start with a poll. The question for you all, and please respond in the chat, is what comes to mind when you think of victims' rights? What comes to mind when you think of victims' rights? Take a moment to think about that and put something in the chat. So we have safety. It's come up a couple times. Justice, compassion, equity, restorative justice, protection, having a voice, restoration, fairness, repair, prioritizing victims. Some great responses there. Okay, as we go forward, we're going to be, Lenore and Aswad are going to talk in four aspects. Provide a historical perspective on system attempts to serve victims. Discuss how retribution, punishment, and incarceration has failed to serve victims or provide public safety. We want to ask, when we listen to victims, what do they say and what do they want? And finally, we want to cover some legislative changes and promising practices. We will stop periodically to take questions as well as take opportunities to get your input through targeted polls and reflection questions. We invite you to be interactive and share input and questions throughout the chat. I also want to note that for those of you who are getting credits to be here, please stay for the duration of the presentation in order to get those credits. So with that, I want to get started with Aswad. So Lenore's book actually started with Aswad, so we want to start with you today. What was your experience with the justice system after becoming a victim of crime?
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks to everybody for joining today's important conversation. My name is Aswad Thomas, and when I think about the impact of violence, on my life, on my family's life, violence has impacted my life for the past 30 years. Starting in 1993, I lost my best friend to a drive-by shooting. He was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting in 1993. And since then, I've lost over 40 friends to gun violence. But despite losing so many friends to gun violence around me, I never thought that I would become a victim of gun violence. But unfortunately, I did. In 2009, just after becoming the first male in my family to ever graduate from college, I was also days away from going over to Europe to start my professional basketball career when I was shot twice in my back while leaving a convenience store in my neighborhood. And, those bullets ended my basketball career and nearly ended my life. And that was such a life-changing experience for me. I remember being released from the hospital just a few days after that shooting, and I was released from the hospital back into the same neighborhood where I was shot. So I spent months recovering from these 2 gunshot wounds to my back on my mother's living room, on my mother's living room, on her couch in a small 1-bedroom apartment. So dealing with so many experiences, dealing with so many emotions of dealing with the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression, the flashbacks. My doctors, they warned me about the physical challenges that I would have, but nobody never mentioned the psychological effects of being a victim of gun violence. And so after my shooting, the hospital never followed up with me, but law enforcement did come to visit me several times during my recovery process. And each time that they came to visit me, they never asked me how I was doing. They never told me about victim compensation. They never told me about any victim services that was available in my community. In fact, they never connected me with a victim advocate in their department who's supposed to work with victims like myself. They were primarily only focused on the case, not on my healing and my well-being after becoming a victim. And, during this recovery process, those late nights of me tossing and turning and dealing with those flashbacks and nightmares, I often thought, am I the only person who went through this experience of being a victim but not getting any help after that incident? And so what I did was I called my father. My father was a victim of gun violence in the 1980s. I called my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, when you got shot, did you get any help?" And my dad said no. So I called my second oldest brother, who was also a victim of gun violence in the 1990s, and asked him that same question. After you got shot, did you get any help? And the answer was no. And then I called my cousin. My cousin was also shot in the early 2000s, and as a result of that shooting, he's been paralyzed from the waist down. And I asked him that same question: did you get any help? And he said no. So in my immediate family, 5 out of the 10 males have been victims of gun violence, but we all had plenty interactions with the justice system, but none that actually led to getting any victim compensation or getting any victim services after those experiences. But the thing that changed my life and got me involved in this work, one of the things was, during my final surgery to remove the bullets out of my back, my doctor started to tell me a story of a teenager whose life he had saved 4 years before I was shot. And the more details he shared about that teenager at that time, I was starting to realize that he was describing one of the teenagers who had shot me. And right there, I remember telling my doctor that I don't know if you know this, but you just described the teenager that shot me. And I remember my doctor just, sitting there in silence, and he said, "This is how the cycle of violence continues in communities, because just like me, the hospital discharged that 14-year-old teenager back into that same community with no access to services and support." So, I was just, just contemplating and just thinking about, what it must have been like for that 14-year-old teenager to have to deal with that, recovering from that gunshot wound, which caused him to be blind in his left eye, and having to grapple with the pain, the depression, the trauma, the anxiety that I knew all too well as an adult. And I just started to really think about, my experience, and started to think about his experience, but also started to think about what would have been like in his own life, in mine, right? If that young man had received victim services, housing relocation support, things to help him and his family deal with the trauma that they had experienced. Had he gotten any help, maybe I would have never became a victim of gun violence. And so the justice system, the hospital, the lack of victim services failed me and him, just like the system has failed so many crime victims across the country, especially in low-income communities and communities of color as well. And so I wanted to start this conversation of sharing those experiences, but also want to hear from you all as well. Scott, we'd love to do another poll. We'd love to hear from you all. What percentage of California crime victims felt very supported by the criminal justice system after they experienced a crime? So once again, what percentage of victims felt very supported by the criminal justice system after they experienced a crime? I see a lot of 5%, 14%. Very few, 78%. 49%, 5%. And let's show the answer on our screen, Scott. Then I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, so this is what folks said. People mostly said between 14 and 5%. Jackie, can you show us the correct answer?
I have to voice over that one. It's 14%.
Okay, 14%. So, as we reflect on that, it's those of us on this call that have responsibilities to support victims, and just think about what that tells us if we know that a good many of victims are not satisfied by the process. It's just something to hold on to and think about. Oswald, thank you so much for continuing to share your difficult and traumatic story. And let's now turn to Lenore. Lenore, fabulous book, by the way. I think it's message and untold story that you tell in your book. Can you your book started with Oswald's story. And can you tell us what that has to do with victims' rights, its relevance to that?
Sure. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Aswad, for grounding us in your experience that's all too common, as we can see when we look at those poll results. So the year that Aswad was shot, 2009, that was the year that he was victimized. That is also the year that incarceration in the United States rose to the highest level it has ever been in U.S. history. So I was partly motivated to start this book with Aswad's story because it was so jarring to me to realize and think about what else was happening in 2009. Okay. One of the things that was happening was it was the year that incarceration was the highest that it has ever reached in the United States. And the other thing that was happening in 2009 is it was the year that for the first time, there was a 1-year double jump in the amount of available money for victim compensation and victim services in the United States. Federal dollars reached a $5 billion mark in terms of marked for the provision of victim services and victim compensation. And, and yet, thinking about that juxtaposition of unprecedented levels of available services and support earmarked for victims, unprecedented levels of incarceration, and yet what we just heard was happening all over the country, an experience of being victimized by violence and left on your own to recover. And so, pointing out that gap in sort of the promise of the victims' rights movement versus the reality was so much of what I wanted to share when I put this book together. In 2009, that was in many ways, it was the culmination of the impact of the first victims' rights movement in the country on the impact that victims' rights movement had on politics and policy and budgets. And yet we know that those expenditures on incarceration and even the money earmarked for victim assistance really failed to get to people who had been experiencing victimization and really failed to stop cycles of harm. So, I had also seen this failure close up as a young attorney graduating from law school and working in California. I was helping parents of incarcerated youth in 2001 try and advocate for alternatives to incarceration. And what I saw at that time was that very few of the young people that I was encountering as defendants, right, as people who were going into, at the time, it was the California Youth Authority, very few of those young people had not been a victim of crime long before ever ending up in our juvenile justice system as a defendant. So the vast majority of young people I was encountering had, experienced everything from, childhood sexual assault, only to be taken out of their homes and placed in foster care and experiencing sexual assault in that environment again. Young people who had been assaulted on the way to school, witnessing violence in the streets, chronically exposed to violence as children with little to no help. As no surprise, years later end up in our juvenile justice system as defendants. So, for me, being a Californian, this idea that this is, the state that has done so much for victims' rights, it really stood in stark contrast to me as what I understood happening for most of the young people that I was encountering. And that's how we started looking at the issue of victims' rights and what it really has meant. And that's really informed a lot of the work that our organization has done for the last 10 or so years. What I want to do now is just sort of walk through for all of you that history, what has been the history of the victims' rights movement, what were accomplishments, what were some of the misses, and then how can we build something more inclusive, moving forward. So this first slide just goes through a little bit of the history here. A lot of people are not aware of this, but California is actually home to the original victims' rights movement actually came out of this state. And it then swept across the country, beginning in the 1970s. Former governor and then later President Ronald Reagan was a huge champion of victims' rights. He kind of took the call for victims' rights from California and brought it with him when he went into the White House. And so it gained national prominence and influence in the 1980s. Now, what's key to know here is that it emerged, the victims' rights movement emerged out of a recognition that far too often victims were ignored in the criminal justice system. Our adversarial system, which is set up to be the state versus people accused of committing crime, means that victims don't have a lot of standing in that, right? They were in many ways witnesses at best in terms of legal standing in the criminal justice system. So like I said, California was, sort of home to the most vocal components of this victims' rights movement. And what ended up happening is, despite the original intent being sort of recognizing that victims didn't have a lot of rights in court and weren't getting a lot of help in the community, politically, ultimately, that victims' rights movement aligned itself with law and order politicians to call for solutions to that problem that put a lot more emphasis on kind of this idea at the time that used to get talked about a lot of evening the playing field, it used to be called, between the rights of victims and the rights of people who are accused of committing crime. So a lot of the policy victories that came out of that period between the 1970s and the 1990s, a lot of the policy victories were in essentially three categories. One is the establishment of victim compensation as a right that victims have, and the establishment of some victim services. But then importantly, a huge emphasis on a lot of the laws that were enacted under the original victims' rights movement. A huge emphasis was on procedural rights for victims and a shrinking of some of the eligibility and rights of people who are accused of crime. So we see things like the establishment of the right to notification of proceedings, impact statements, but then that's combined with a lot of limiting of rights for people who are accused of crime, whether that's limiting people's right to pretrial release, limiting their right to appeals, limiting their right to access to rehabilitative services inside incarceration facilities. Okay, so that was what was happening in the 70s through the 90s. And so what are the tangible legal results of all that? Well, here we go at the federal level. There's been sort of numerous federal laws, but what you see right here in front of you are the three big ones, right? The first one is the establishment in 1984 of the Victims of Crime Act, which is federal dollars that go to states for victim assistance grants and victim compensation. The second one is the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which was sort of the precursor to VAWA and basically began putting a ton of federal money into domestic violence prevention and shelter and transitioning support. And then the third is the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, which is really focused on resources for states to address and prevent gender-based violence. VAWA has evolved quite a bit over time. All of these have, but these are the years that they got established and what they initially sort of set out to do. In terms of that's at the federal level. What's happened at the state level is something that I'm anticipating many of y'all are familiar with, which are Victims' Bill of Rights. So every state in the country between the 1980s and the 1990s adopted a set of victims' rights. 36 states actually include those rights as a constitutional amendment, okay? And what these laws typically say revolve around the right to attend criminal proceedings, be heard in criminal cases, the right to notification of proceedings, the right to compensation from the state compensation program, and also the right to restitution. So these are major accomplishments, right? And just to go one layer deeper, between 1980 and the year 2000, there were over 36,000 pieces of legislation passed, 36,000 laws passed that were part of this push for victims' rights, okay? 36,000, no shortage of policy change happened. And this is what I've just distilled down for you, are the essence of what many of those say. But still, we learned from Aswad's testimony here at the beginning that too many victims have actually not attained access to assistance or felt supported by the justice system. And the experience of not getting help from the justice system is unequal, right? So we see, on race and socioeconomic lines, very, very different experiences of attaining assistance or getting help from the criminal justice system. So when we talk about this gap between what the law books say and what happens in reality, that's a gap that is especially true for victims of color in the United States. And that's part of what drives our work to expand access to compensation and the like. So let's go through, some of the common experiences that are reported, okay? My organization, Aswad and I, survey victims of crime across the country. We do annual surveys and sometimes multiple times in different states. We've interviewed more than 10,000 victims of crime, primarily victims of violence, in the last 10 years. And these are some of the things that we have heard the most from people who have been harmed by crime and violence. First, they often, especially, like I said, along race and socioeconomic lines, we hear victims report out being treated more like a suspect than a victim when they're interacting with the criminal justice system. A huge gap in information, ignored, phone calls not returned, no knowledge about what's happening in the criminal case, if there is a criminal case at all, lacking protection in the community. This is a very common theme, where victims are terrified to participate in the criminal justice process because they know that they will not be protected when they return to their communities, and they'll be a target for additional violence. Re-traumatized by interactions with lawyers and the media. This is very common. And by the way, that re-traumatization happens from defense attorneys as well as prosecutors in terms of how they interact and speak with victims. No voice in the case resolution process. So not all victims, will learn later, want sort of the toughest outcome possible in terms of sentencing. A lot of victims who are looking for things like restorative justice don't report out that they feel like they have a voice. And then the last, and importantly, there is no compensation and no restitution that most victims actually gain access to, and that is a huge gap. So, you know, I talk in the book about this concept of a hierarchy of harm, which is very differential treatment in the criminal justice system, depending on who the victim is. And, you know, this is, you know, from our perspective, one of the biggest, if not the biggest barrier to improve safety that, you know, that we think exists. You know, I was so excited to read all y'all's comments about, you know, what victims' rights means to you, and the word safety came out so much. You know, recognition, support, you know, compassion. You know, these are the words that that y'all are sort of saying, hey, this is what victims' rights means. And what we know is the reality is so different. And in fact, our justice system and our victim compensation programs are embedded with this hierarchy of harm that really prevents the vast majority of victims from getting access to those very things that y'all would like to see it achieve. So, you know, there's some common myths that are really the drivers of that hierarchy of harm. And we're going to talk a little bit about those myths and what they mean practically, right? So one of the most common myths is that most crime incidents, you know, enter the justice system, and so therefore most victims get help. Okay. Well, as y'all know, I anticipate, but just to underscore and underline, the idea that most crime incidents enter the justice system at all is a really difficult myth, because what it means is if you think victims are going to get help because they're interacting with the justice system, well, they're not, because most victims are not actually interacting, right? So, you know, for most victims of crime, those bills of rights that are attached to criminal proceedings never come about, right? Because 6 in 10 violent crimes are not even reported in. Okay, 6 in 10 violent crimes across the United States are not reported to law enforcement, and a small fraction of those that are reported result in prosecution. And so what that means is that a lot of the courtroom rights, you know, aren't relevant for most victims because they're not in courtrooms. All right, so this is a really important point. When we think about supporting the safety of victims, we have to meet them where they're at. And by and large, they are not actually in courts or in prosecutors' offices or in police stations. Okay. The second thing that's important to point out here is restitution. Less than 1% of crime victims receive a restitution. 77% of restitution in California goes unpaid. And even when it's paid for the 1% that do get it paid, it's typically paid in very small increments over long stretches of time and can't actually serve as a real venue for financial support, which is what so many victims of violence in particular really need is financial support. Okay. And the part of the reason so few victims are getting that restitution is connected to the prior point I made, which is if crimes are not being pursued at the scale that they're occurring, they're not going to be in court and they're not going to get restitution orders. Okay, another myth is an important one, which is that victims can get help if they want to. You know, we hear this a lot when we say, hey, you know, we talk to administrators across the country and they say, hey, you know, what we're here, you know, we can provide help. If victims want help, they can get it. Well, the realities are just dramatically different than that. Okay. First of all, you know, we've done surveys asking whether or not victims were told about victim compensation at any point, despite the fact that the justice system is legally required. And you can go back to the prior slide. I was just giving a little context. Oh no, I'm sorry. You're right. I had it wrong. Sorry about that. The most victims don't know. They don't know. They hadn't heard about it. They weren't told, despite the fact that the justice system is legally required. And then for the victims, so most victims are never told about compensation. Then for the ones who are told and who apply, very few actually get approvals, okay? And there's reasons why victims don't get approved for receiving compensation. One of them is that there are these sort of on its face neutral, sort of eligibility restrictions that in practice have a very discriminatory impact on who gets it. Okay, so on this slide, you'll see some of those things listed out. All right, so first, contributing to your own victimization sounds neutral enough, but frankly, it's quite vague. And it also is applied in racially discriminatory ways in most states, whether, even if it's not intentional, that's typically what happens is it has a disparate impact on victims of color. And so, we see that that sort of vague barrier knocks a lot of compensation applications out the door, and folks don't get compensation. Exclusions based on conviction or prior status. A lot of people who are victims of violence or victims of crime may be on probation or parole or have been recently released from the justice system when they're harmed. That prevents them in many states from getting access to compensation, which is a huge barrier. California is one of only 7 states that denies people on probation and parole from getting access to compensation, depending on the felonies that they had been convicted of. And then in a lot of states, police cooperation is required in order to get compensation. And that's a tough one when you think about the fact that so many people are quite terrified, literally life or death considerations for them as to whether or not they participate in the criminal process. So other barriers to compensation, just to go through those, is that, there are caps on expenses that don't match with, the realities of how much it costs when people are victimized, especially by violence. And there's also a lack of coverage for a lot of emergency things. Our organization ourselves has, created our own little sort of mini fund of money that we will use to help because there's so little public money available for really basic things. There's a survivor in the Fresno area who had became a custodial grandparent who became a custodial parent when their daughter was killed, and they didn't have even basic things. They didn't have diapers. They didn't have car seats. They lived on a fixed income. These are not things that they could get access to, and those babies were their responsibility from that day forward. And so that's the kind of example of what the emergency is so serious. We've had other victims report that they couldn't fix bullet holes in their front doors. I mean, these are things that are emergencies when you're living with that level of fear. And those are the kinds of things that a lot of times are not covered, or at least not. And if they are covered, it's some sort of arduous reimbursement process. And that speaks to the last point on this slide here, which is just that there's, burdensome red tape that really gets in the way of urgent help. And especially, thinking about just those examples I just gave, if it's reimbursement based, even if you are approved and you have to wait till reimbursement, that means you have to pay up front. Well, most people who are living on fixed incomes really can't do that. Related to those exclusions, there's another myth that drives the hierarchy of harm. And that's this really profound myth that victims and people committing crimes are completely separate groups of people, right? And this myth that there's just sort of, innocent victims in one side of, our communities and people who are committing crimes on the other, that myth, if that is the belief, that is going to lead to really different policies, right? Than what we would suggest might be more important to look at, right? Which is the ways in which there's overlapping life circumstances and what that means from a policy perspective. Rather than there being 2 distinct groups, there's tremendous overlap between the life circumstances of people who are most commonly victims of crime and the life circumstances of people who are most commonly committing crime and convicted of committing crime. Okay. In fact, those life circumstances are so overlapping as to be virtually indistinguishable. And what kind of circumstances are we talking about? Poverty, adverse childhood experiences, which means, chronic and repeat exposure to violence, perhaps exposure to violence either in home or at the community level, mental health needs that have gone unmet. It may be substance use disorder is also at play. These are the kinds of very common experiences that whether you are a victim one day or a person who's been convicted another, you're having those experiences. And so what that means is we're talking about the same people, right? And this really matters from a perspective of like, well, then how do we get victims help, and why is it so important to get victims help? Part of what, what this means is that, if we think of victims and people who are committing crimes as wholly separate, never the twain shall meet, the public policy goal, which is a public policy goal this country has had for 40 plus years, is just separate them, right? Separate them for as long as possible, right? That's the goal, right? Because they're different people. But if you flip the script and really understand the ways in which life circumstances can have a huge impact on the likelihood that you're either going to get hurt or you're going to hurt someone else. If we understood that, right, as a vulnerability to either is related to life circumstance, then what we would actually do was we would be focusing almost all of our energy on stopping that cycle by preventing victims from becoming victims again or becoming perpetrators later in life, right? So supporting victims, reducing trauma, giving people access to safety in real time would become our top public safety goal, essentially. So let me stop there. That's a little bit about the history and the barriers.
Thank you, Lenore, for that. Let's have another poll question. What percentage of individuals entering the criminal justice system as defendants have a prior history of trauma? Are we doing on the poll? Let's see. So most people said 90%, and you are correct, 90%. So as Lenore described, rather than two distinct groups, there is a huge commonality and overlapping circle of those who have been harmed and those who cause harm. Lenore, I want to ask you a question sort of to that point. Traditional attempts to provide public safety center on punishment and retribution. Can you talk about some of the effects of these practices, given how many people entering the system come in with prior experiences, victims of crime and or survivors of trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know about the impacts of trauma, the brain science is clear, right? And this is universal. It has nothing to do with zip code. It has everything to do with just being a human being. And the way that human beings react to trauma is pretty consistent, right? Which is hypervigilance, which is anxiety, stress, difficulty, processing when the decisions have to be Okay, why am I describing this? Because then what happens after someone is convicted, if they have prior histories of trauma, which we know 90% do, we place them in environments that are triggers for trauma, right? That are literally, high intensity from a sensitivity perspective, right? Whether it's exposure, constant exposure to violence inside some of these facilities, or whether it's, difficulty, with, isolation. These are all things that actually worsen trauma, right? And so it's so important for us to ask ourselves, how is it where, we have designed, our sentencing approach in ways that actually exacerbate people's underlying trauma and unaddressed trauma. Again, these things are resolvable. One of the things that I love so much about the brain science around trauma is that, we have this saying, and I'm sure y'all know it, hurt people, right? Well, there's another saying, which is heal people, right? And the reason that matters so much is because what it means is you can heal from unaddressed trauma. That's what the brain science says, right? Universally, everyone has the ability to recover from it, but you have to be having given a pathway to recover from it, as opposed to being in environments that are unsafe, such that you're constantly triggered and you're constantly in a state of hypervigilance. Okay. And that's what a lot of the experience of being in the incarceration system does. Family separation, toughening up. These are all, the kind of the wrong approach if we want to address trauma. It fails to break the cycle of harm. Ultimately, Scott, that's what we're talking about. And I just should mention that a lot of the post-release exclusions that people face are also triggers for hypervigilance and stress, in terms of exclusion for jobs, exclusion for housing, exclusion for loans, right? So we're setting people up to be kind of in a constant state of trigger, and that's going to be super bad for public safety. But I know that the folks who are on this Zoom today are experts in your own right, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts on what you think. You could put in the chat the ways that you think the justice system triggers trauma, and then another question just being, what are some ways to interrupt that?
Okay, we'll let that come into the chat. Give it a minute. Here we go. Problem-specific treatment. Forcing folks to cold turkey detox inside facilities. Inside of providing MAT. Instead. Oh, okay. Any other thoughts? Technical assistance, trauma-informed care, unrealistic conditions of supervision for young people, not being trauma-informed, not trained in trauma or healing approaches. Great, keep these coming, and let's have another Zoom question. Poll question. True or false? By nearly a 5-to-1 margin, victims in California say that prison either makes it more likely someone will commit crimes or has no public safety impact at all. Still see some good things in the chat coming in as you're also thinking about this question that's posted. Okay, and the answer to this is true. By nearly a 5-to-1 margin, victims in California say that prison either makes it more likely someone will commit crimes or has no public safety impact at all. Think about that and think if that's surprising to you. I guess it wasn't based on your answer. Of course, Lenore probably helped us come to that conclusion today. Here's another question, true or false? For people convicted of serious or violent crime, Victims prefer by a 2-to-1 margin, authorizing judges to determine the length of the sentence that is most appropriate based on individual circumstances and best practices, instead of mandatory requirements for certain sentence lengths. That's a mouthful question, but hopefully you can unpack that and read it there. But the question really is, should judges be, do victims believe that judges should be able to tailor sentences based on the specifics of the case rather than mandatory requirements? So the answer to that, and that is correct, the answer is true. So we want to take a pause here and see if there's any, Lenore gave us a lot to think about. And so we want to either invite in the chat some questions, or you can unmute yourself. And if there's any questions you have for Lenore right now, let's take a few minutes to do that. Lenore, that was quite a lot to think about. Particularly the history and the challenges facing victims. A lot to think about, and a lot, really a call to action for us, on this webinar. So, any other questions that people have? Feel free again to unmute yourself. Or use the chat. Okay, so here's one. There are many challenges, but how do we begin to heal or start the process of reform for victims?
Well, that's really a great setup question for, kind of where we wanted to go with this conversation next. And I see the additional comment here that there's often a focus on the injustice, and then we don't go further into the solutions. Well, Aswad and I are going to talk about some of the solutions, but just to give you a sort of a headline response to the question is that, I think what we've found is that, we have to be willing to have difficult conversations and name what's happening. And that is going to require significant outreach. We started, in California in 2012, and now we operate in 8 states across the country. And, what we started off doing was focus groups, surveys, outreach, talking to not just victims of violence, but the mom and pop, the small organizations that, get little to no support or recognition from the criminal justice system as a public safety organization, but that are doing that work all day, right? The healing circles where the grandmother goes to every single, homicide, location and tries to help families navigate, right? There's this sort of grassroots, almost unrecognized ecosystem of leaders in communities hardest hit who are doing the work that has not happened through the official channels, right? They're helping people get emergency support. They're trying to figure out how to mediate conflicts, help people coming out of prison get jobs. Those organizations need to be brought in as equal partners and need to be brought in as folks that we're talking to and that we're especially listening to. That's a lot of the work that has informed us. And, you'll hear about the sort of the policy solutions that have come up as a result of that. But ultimately, it starts with who are you listening to and who are you partnering with? And if we can start with listening to victims who have been most harmed and least helped, and then partnering with community leaders who have already been trying to solve these problems, we can get real far in terms of the healing that we all seek.
Lenore, I think that's a really good place to segue. There's a couple more questions in the chat and we could read through them, but I think some of them, like are there promising jurisdictions, we can hit in the latter part of this segment. So maybe right now, this is a good time to ask Oswald a question. So based on the last polls, we know that victims largely do not feel that punishment promotes rehabilitation or even safety. So Oswald, when we listen to victims, what do they say? What do they want?
Yeah, and as Lenore mentioned, through a lot of our work, we do a lot of listening to victims. As Lenore mentioned, we are listening to victims at those candlelight vigils. We do a lot of phone calls and surveys. I'm often traveling, almost weekly meeting with victims in California and also across the country. And there's a lot that we've learned over the years. This past decade of talking to thousands of victims about the failures of the justice system, the failures of things like compensation and victim services, but also what we've heard from victims is their perspectives on the justice system. And many victims, as you all have outlined in our poll results, right, the system is failing survivors, failing people who have came in contact with the justice system. And most victims feel that the traditional punitive system is broken and does not serve them. The majority of crime victims prefer shorter sentences rather than long-term sentences as well. And a majority of crime victims prefer we focus more on rehabilitation rather than punishing people. And for most victims, there are often two things that we want. We want what happened to us to never happen again. And we want what happened to us to never happen to someone else as well. And so we really must listen to victims about what safety and justice looks like to them. And for most victims who experience concentrated crime and violence in low-income communities and communities of color, those victims haven't been represented in policy debates and really haven't had a role in helping to develop the policies and programs that help prevent crime from happening in the first place, but also interrupting violence as well. And, most victims want, the system to focus more on reducing crime through prevention, as we heard in a chat box today, through more crisis assistance, and also really focus on more on building stronger communities rather than being more punitive or increasing incarceration rates. And so many crime victims, when you actually talk to crime victims, you hear the solutions very clearly on what they would have wanted in their experience or their family experience, also what they want out of the justice system. And the solutions are very simple. You all, for most crime victims, safety has never been about just locking people up and throwing away the key. Safety is more about violence prevention. Safety is about more investing in youth programs, more substance abuse and mental health programs, and also really building this infrastructure of victim services in communities to help people access the healing and support that they need, whether it's that short-term or long-term as well. But also safety is also ensuring that people who have caused a harm have access to rehabilitative programs while they are incarcerated, and also have a reason to pursue those rehabilitation programs as well. And safety is also when people are coming out of the justice system, that they're able to access jobs, housing, education programs. Those are the things that help promote stability, economic stability for people. And also those are the things that help keep communities safe. Those are the things that help stop the cycle of violence. So that's how we really get to real safety in our homes, also in our communities. If we just listen to crime victims and what they are saying about the justice system, I think we can continue to move this nation's forward on a different a kind of justice system, which is focused on healing and well-being at the center.
That's really great. And as you know, I'm thinking about the hierarchy of harm. I'm thinking about young people and communities where they reside, and really gets to some of the chat questions here about prevention and where we make our investments. And what are some promising practices? And so with that, maybe Lenore and Aswad, you can cover what you've seen. Are there hopeful practices that are coming up across the nation? And let's highlight some of those and legislative changes.
So we're gonna start with California here, and we'll go through some of the key changes, and then afterwards I'll mention what's happening in other states.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll start, once again, we've been able to build a movement of survivors where we have 50,000 survivors in California, over 200,000 survivors across the country. And so a lot of our survivors in the state of California have been at the center of changing policies in collaboration with other organizations and advocates across the state. So number one, once again, as I talked about, we need to build a stronger infrastructure of victim services in the communities. The Trauma Recovery Center model is a breakthrough in an evidence-based model that was designed to meet the needs of the hardest to reach survivors of violent crime and help them heal, help them recover from trauma. And the TRCs that support that the services provide is a comprehensive case management services, mental health services, individual, family and group counseling, also helping to help victims access the victims compensation program, also help to connect victims to other services, social services that they need as well. So the Trauma Recovery Center, Proposition 47, which is a ballot measure, have been moving tens of millions of dollars in the state of California to fund more trauma recovery centers. We started with one back in 2014. Now we have 22 of these trauma recovery centers across the state, and also bills like SB 71 that was passed in 2013. Each year, it allocates about $2 million per year to fund trauma recovery centers, which is, once again, it's about building this ecosystem, building this infrastructure of victim services to enroll people into systems of care through the Trauma Recovery Center model. In addition to that, before I turn it over to Lenore, as Lenore walked through a lot of the barriers as it relates to victims compensation, we've been able to pass several reforms in the state of California. For example, SB 375, which passed in 2019. For a lot of victims, often it's their first time hearing about victims compensation programs, 5 years later, 10 years, sometimes even 20 years after becoming a victim of violent crime. So we passed a bill in 2019 that increased the time limit for victims to apply for compensation up to 7 years, which is a huge increase to help victims get that support that's needed. In addition to that, we worked on reforms to increase the expense caps needed for compensation as well. And also we have a bill, AB 160, that really works to remove those barriers, as Lenore mentioned, for people on parole or probation, for them to access victims compensation. But more work is needed through the budget to have appropriations requests to really sustain funding for the victim compensation this year. So I'll pause there. I want to touch on trauma recovery centers and victim compensation. Lenore, I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the other policy reforms.
Great, and just two quick additional points on what you laid out, Aswad, which is just, I saw, Karen, your comment in the chat about the need for funding stability. We couldn't agree more. We have tried to make victim compensation and victim assistance programs general fund operating obligations. As you all know, most of the time there's federal funds which are combined with restitution funds, and that's how those operate. But we couldn't agree more. It should be general operating. It should be required. And then just wanted to also mention on the trauma recovery centers, California is the state that had the first trauma recovery center. Started off with just one trauma recovery center in San Francisco, and we started advocating for the replication of this model in 2013. And I think, Aswad, are we at 22 now in California?
Yep, 22.
22 trauma recovery centers. Our humble vision is that there should be a trauma recovery center in every community across the country. But it's partly because it combines that emergency assistance with that long-term therapeutic support. And just some of the positive impacts of the trauma recovery center model is you see increased returns to work, you see increased stability in housing, and you also see reduced PTSD, reduced sort of depression, and you see more actual cooperation with the justice system. So these are holistic long-term care centers that can make a real difference in terms of stopping that cycle. And so we can move into the next. So some other things that we've advocated for in California. We were really excited about this. As y'all heard, we were describing in the barriers to victim compensation, this idea that it's like, okay, it's reimbursement based and you have to apply and then you have to wait months to hear. And then, so you're like trying to, pay up front for things that you're hoping you get reimbursed for. You may or may not. If you do get reimbursed, may not be at the right amount. Just doesn't work for most people, especially people living on fixed incomes. And that's a lot of survivors. So we advocated for the establishment of something called the FAST grant program, which is the first of its kind in the country. One of the questions was what states are doing it right? Actually, California is on its way to being a kind of a standout if we can get this program off the ground and some of the other reforms. And those are all reforms that we've ushered in through advocacy with our partner organizations over the last 10 years. So this is all very recent changes. But this FAST program has not been enacted yet. But just to give you a sense, it would be flexible funds upfront. So the way it would work is organizations, the small organizations, the grassroots organizations that are essentially victim assistance organizations in neighborhoods hardest hit, would get grants, and they could use those grants however needed. It's a hotel room, right? Someone's cell phone got stolen at the same time that they were robbed. They need a cell phone to call their family members to find out where to go that night. People need car seats, like I was describing. Those emergency help needs would be able to be met through this grant program. The legislature allocated $50 million, but it has not yet been enacted. And so we're hoping that the program authorization will happen in this budget cycle and we'll be able to get that off the ground. What's key here is showing the impacts of this, right? If we can demonstrate that helping people get the kind of emergency help they need when they're in crisis post-injury, reduces future victimization. This is really key. One of the comments in the chat also was about preventative measures. Couldn't agree more. And we think of victim assistance as a preventative measure, right? Because what we know is who's most vulnerable to getting hurt by crime and violence is someone who has been hurt before, right? The number one indicator that you're likely to be a future victim of violence is if you have been one in the past. Okay, so if we had a goal of getting help to people in crisis post-injury, we would actually reduce the likelihood that they would become victims in the future. And that drives so much of we're trying to get that concept of preventative cycles of preventing cycles of violence.
Oh, I'm just gonna have my
Really
alarm up.
incorporate
So I'm just taking a break.
And then the next slide we'll go into is another thing that we're excited about, which is AB 60, which is the right to notification. This is the right to notification about community-based restorative justice programs. And what it says is that victims must be notified early and as often as possible about the availability of community-based restorative justice programs. This is also a national standout. Okay, if we can, if this can become the mainstay in terms of operating of the juvenile and criminal justice system, this would be a huge standout for the country. So juvenile probation must notify about this. And in 2025, information may also be added to the victims' rights card for this. So let me ask a question, because we're really excited about AB 60, but also recognize that not everyone is aware. So just wanted to ask a poll question. How many of y'all are aware of AB 60? And I think we need poll question 5. I'm looking at 4 up on the screen. There we go. So how many of y'all were aware? Okay. Okay, so 82% not aware. If you were aware, for the 18% of y'all that were aware, can you share in the chat how you're implementing it? Anybody want to share how they're implementing AB 60? Okay, all cases that come to the DA's office are for review are considered for restorative justice for juvenile cases. Okay, so implementation through the Juvenile Probation Department. Thanks to both of those comments. And I think what's key to recognize here is just there's also just a huge gap in awareness that this law exists. So that should be one big takeaway for everyone leaving today, is that spreading the word about this is critical. And then there was a question I want to make sure we get to about the FAST grant program. Do you know the Assembly or Senate bill that proposed the FAST grant program? We can get that to you. I don't know it off the top of my head, because it was through the budget last legislative cycle, so it was one of those budget trailer bills that the California legislature does. But we can get you the exact number if you'd like. And like I said, the key for us this year is to get it authorized, because it was not completely, the process hasn't finished. We got to get it authorized because of the budget challenges. So we want to make sure it's included. All right, so we wanted to share some more. I'm going to hand it back to you, Aswad.
Awesome. Thanks, Lenore. A big part of our work is really working to expand more protections for survivors. So on the screen are several bills that we've passed over the years. I'll just highlight 3 of them. For example, AB 2992. So many survivors and victims across the state of California who have lost a loved one to homicide. We hear the stories over and over again of parents and siblings and even children having to return immediately back to work after losing a loved one to homicide, during that process, trying to navigate funerals and burial process, trying to just really cope with what happened. People are having to return back to work because they are in fear of losing their job. So this bill, extended the right to job protections, to have victims and families get time off for those who have lost loved ones to homicide. In addition, to really expand, especially for victims of gun violence as well, homicide victims. Another key part of our bill that we worked on was SB 1190. Once again, so many survivors are having to live in unsafe homes. There are strong protections for victims of domestic violence or victims of sexual assault. So we've worked to, expand existing law that allow more survivors to end a lease early without having that penalty after a break-in, at least because a home is no longer safe. Either there was a incident of violence in their home, or someone broke in their home and caused victimization. We've worked to extend those protections for a majority and a broader set of crime victims, and also allow for those crime victims to submit documentation. We know that for many individuals who have a eviction on their record, just the financial impact that have on families, which often result in what we call victimization debt. So being able to strengthen those protections for more survivors is critical. And then many of our youth who are also experiencing violence or losing a loved one to violence also need time away from school. So we passed SB 350 that increased the number of days a student who loses a loved one to violence can be excused from school from 1 day up to 5 days without being labeled as truant as well. So those are some of the policies that work to expand the protections for children and youth, also housing and employment protections as well. And a lot of these reforms that I've mentioned, come from survivors directly, come from the grassroots organizations that we work with across the state. And a big part of our work is an event called Survivor Speak. So Survivor Speak is an event we've hosted in the state of California since 2013. We expanded out our Survivor Speak events all across the country, where we are bringing survivors from local communities to state capitals across the country. Is really about providing survivors with an opportunity to walk the halls of the Capitol, meet with legislators, and for many survivors, like myself, getting involved in organizing, getting involved in advocacy. That's part of the healing journey for survivors, and also being able to survivors to go to those state capitals where the majority of them have never been to a state capital before. So go there to meet with legislators, to be a voice for themselves or for their loved ones who are no longer there. Is just a life-changing experience, and we provide that through an event called Survivors Speak every year. And it's really about bringing survivors to policymakers and collaborating with policy makers to work on some of the policies that we've identified today. We strongly believe that in order to really achieve true safety in our communities, the voices of survivors must be heard. Survivors must come together with policymakers, law enforcement, criminal justice stakeholders, service providers to really create a new vision of public safety in our communities, but also work to build a stronger ecosystem, a stronger infrastructure of victim services that's rooted in healing and prevention, that helps stop the cycle of violence. A lot of what we've talked about today. And, often through my work, I started today's webinar thinking about and talking about the young teenager who shot me, who was also a victim of gun violence, and how that unaddressed trauma played a huge role with me getting shot years later. And that teenager was never arrested for my shooting. A few months after I got shot, that teenager was also shot again and had lifelong complications, health complications from that second shooting after my incident. But there was another teenager that was involved in my shooting who was arrested at 19 years old. And I forgave that other teenager, who was arrested for my shooting, and that teenager was looking at 40 years in prison. Through my forgiveness and through my advocacy for that young man, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which I got accountability that I wanted. But I knew that him being sentenced at 19 years old to 40 years in prison would not help me heal, would not help me recover from that incident. It also would not help him and his family as well. So when you talk to survivors, we all have different views and perspectives on the justice system. It's really about helping people heal and recover. It's really about preventing crime. It's also really about ensuring that people have opportunity to come home one day. And that's when my healing started. That's when I decided to get involved with crime survivors for safety and justice, is thinking about those 2 young men involved in my shooting. We had so many opportunities throughout their lives to intervene, to provide support. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, justice system failed those young men. They failed me, and it failed so many survivors across the state of California and also across the country. What you all heard today was, how we build a really strong and a better justice system is by listening to survivors and what their policy priorities are and what safety really look like for communities as well. So I'll pause there. I know that was a lot that we shared today. I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Well, I just really appreciate both what you're saying, Oswald, and what you're modeling. And it kind of gets to Lenore's comment about healing begets healing. And that's clearly evident in your work. And I can't help but make the connection between this topic and our office's mission, the Office of Youth Community Restoration, to promote healing, to be trauma informed, to be trauma responsive, and to, I think what you really illustrated, to the extent that we can do that, we can break the cycle of trauma. We can reduce crime, but that's going to take a way different approach than what we have largely taken in my 40 years of doing this work. We're going to need more restorative justice. We're going to need more healing. And we're going to need to sort of spend more time in the context and in the communities that are most impacted. So this is just me going ad lib, but I'm thinking if you want to comment on any of that, please do, Lenore, Oswald. And then I want to sort of ask the audience here, the participants, some questions, but want to give you a moment to sort of comment on that and what we could do as an office. I'm really struck by, there was one trauma recovery center and now there's 22, which maybe there's not 58, but there's 22. And that's a long distance in really a short period of time. So want to give you a little couple minutes, given that we have it, to comment on that. And then I will segue to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. And I think what is so critical from our perspective is to really understand how all of what we're talking about today, what does it have to do with public safety, right? I think it's really important. I've been doing criminal justice and public safety work my whole adult life. And I would say oftentimes there's this myth that it's like, oh, you're for criminal justice reform or you're for public safety. And that they're presented as if they're sort of, versus. Well, from our perspective, it's actually the opposite, which is the country is in the middle of a debate about the best pathway to public safety. And from our perspective, helping victims, especially victims who are the least likely to be helped by our justice system and by our victims programs, those that if we center healing, right, and center help, that's actually better for public safety than the 40 years that we are recovering from as a nation. It is safer to focus on restorative justice, trauma recovery, right? Rehabilitation, redemption, things that actually reduce trauma, right? That bring people more into community, more dignity, more connection. That is safer. And I think if we as a country can can kind of transfer or transition how we understand safety and what the best pathway is, it's going to open up a whole new set of public policy priorities. We started off talking about the original victims' rights movement and sort of what it achieved, remarkable accomplishments, whether whether the services got to the right folks or not, you know, and whether or not those, you know, those law changes resulted in, you know, kind of the safety that we all want. The fact that there was a movement of people who were able to have that kind of big impact, for us, it's like, hey, you know, let's take inspiration for that and let's actually move toward a right to heal. Right? Like, what does a victim's right to heal look like and feel like? What does that look like for how our criminal justice system operates? That's so foundational to how we're thinking about these issues, and how we think the next generation of victims' rights advocates, you know, will be moving. Aswan?
Yeah, no, Lenore, you said it all. And this is an organization. This is thank you all so much for being on this webinar. This is an audience of people because y'all care about victims, y'all care about our youth, and you care about safety, right? Many of you are during the day, you didn't take your lunch break today, right? You've been with us after working, a few hours, and then you're going to get back to work, right? After today's webinar, you all care about this work, you care about helping people get their lives back on track, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of you all using your influence, using your power to make those 22 trauma recovery centers in the state of California to go to 54, right, in California to really help implement the restorative justice bill that was passed and really help to center on healing and wellness and safety for our people who are experiencing crime and violence every day, and people and youth who are coming in and out of the justice system.
Well, great. With that, I'm going to ask everybody a few questions, and we want you to use the chat. Again, feel free to unmute yourself and we can have an exchange and a conversation as well. But let's start with this first question. What was something new you learned today or that got your attention? So share in the chat something new or something that really piqued your interest. So what do we have here? We have the FAST grant program, learned about AB 60. There's a need for that information to get out, it appears. Assembly bills to support victims' rights. Again, FAST. Victims' views of what should happen. We really heard, I know there's been a lot of good work done through your victim surveys and getting good information about what victims need. Again, AB 60 is a really big one that comes up for folks, and so I'm hoping this will encourage folks to look further into that. The sort of the overlapping nature of those who are harmed and those who have caused harm is a big one. That relationship. Oswald's story of resilience and fighting for those who were responsible for his shooting. I mean, it's amazing and so thank you, Oswald, for sharing that story with us. The polls. Didn't realize that access to victim compensation had such a low percentage and was so complicated to obtain. Lack of victim centers across the state. And we learned about survivor policy changes. So great, you can keep those going. And please take a look at the chat. Let's have another question. What was something you heard today that you would like to know more about and or implement in your practice to be more victim or survivor centered? What would you like to learn more about? Okay, one response here, thank you. The 22 trauma centers and what they encompass as far as services. That might be something in a minute, Lenore or Oswald, you could talk about. Where are they located? See or hear about an exemplary victim center. So as you think about these questions, Lenore, Oswald, maybe we could respond to some of these.
Yeah, I'll start in just so in California, the trauma recovery centers, and we'll as a follow-up, we will make sure you all have a lot of these resources that we've shared today. The surveys will also include more information about the trauma recovery center. So there are trauma recovery centers in several in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, Alameda, Orange County. There's a trauma recovery center. The first one is in San Francisco. There's a trauma recovery center in Richmond. So in Van Nuys, so across the state, there are TRCs. We'll make sure you all have that information as well. Trying to see if there's anything else. You see anything, Lenore?
And just to describe, I know we have a little bit of the a little time. So just to describe sort of the trauma recovery center model, it was started in San Francisco in 2001. There was a psychologist, a psychologist was working there at the time, and she's now running the National Alliance of Trauma Recovery Centers. Her name's Dr. Alicia Basilari. We call her Dr. B. And anyways, she was first assigned to the General Hospital in San Francisco to provide referrals to victims who had come into the hospital, referrals for counseling, therapy, and other kinds of support as they leave. And she noticed this really disturbing trend. And the trend was that she would hand out these referrals, and within months, she would actually see the same people coming back into the hospital, either re-victimized in the same way, whether it's domestic violence or intimate partner violence, or victims of other types of violence coming in, victims of a different kind of violence, right? So, robbed one day, shot the next. And so she saw this pattern of like, people are being re-victimized, and all these referrals I'm giving out aren't helping, right? So she went and tried to figure out an alternate way to get help. And that's the place from which the Trauma Recovery Center model evolved. It was actually hospital connected, but community based. And it was about assertive outreach. So rather than, and having one comprehensive place where you can get emergency help, for basic things like if you need food, things like that, or you can get help filling out your compensation application, or you can get help with long-term therapeutic support. But it's grounded in this idea that it has to be community-centered, and it has to be culturally competent, and it has to engage assertive outreach, which means you go out into the community, knock on doors, talk to folks. That was one of the biggest transitions they made when they created the Trauma Recovery Center, was rather than, just in the hospital, let me stuff some referrals in your bag of medications as you get out the door. It was actually a way to get to people in their safe setting or in their home setting to help them figure out what kind of support they would need to recover. And this Trauma Recovery Center model in San Francisco had these remarkable results, but it was kind of living grant to grant when we found it, right? So we were, Aswad and I, our organization started off with a small group of victims of violence in California, and we asked, what's the one thing that you would have needed if you could have gotten it? And this idea of like help recovering from trauma was sort of top of the list. And so we started trying to find models out there. And I remembered from my time in the prosecutor's office in San Francisco, I used to refer victims to the Trauma Recovery Center. So we went over there. We said, hey, Dr. B, what's going on with your Trauma Recovery Center? This is a model that, like, I think a lot of victims would want outside of San Francisco. And she says, well, we're actually, living grant to grant, and we're actually getting cut. So our first advocacy was at the state level advocating to get more money to that particular trauma recovery center. And then we did follow-up legislation to get it replicated. And now there's 22. As I just put in the chat, where you can see there's 52 across the country, 22 in California. You can see where they're located and who the service providers are. But just to give you a little bit more flavor about what that model is, it's really a combination of walking through the justice system, walking through your application for compensation, emergency help, food, transportation, help for kids in school, and then long-term therapeutic support.
I don't know if you could speak to this, but this came in the chat from Lucas Lacido, who said they wanted to know about the difference between youth and adult survivor support and advocacy in terms of funding, peer groups, and legislative action groups. I don't know if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, a lot of the advocacy we do is really to get money for all victim services, whether they're serving youth clients or adult clients, or whether it's domestic violence survivors or sexual assault survivors or survivors of human trafficking or survivors of gun violence. We're looking to significantly expand the resources and support that go to all of those groups. One of the things we found is that there's a lot of silos. A lot of times the organizations that serve youth survivors are not integrated with the organizations that serve adult survivors of sexual assault. And so one of the things we do through our Survivors Speak convenings that Aswad was describing is we try and bring together organizations who serve the wide range of victim clients. And what we found is oftentimes they don't know about each other, right? And so just getting in the same room has helped increase some cohesion. And that's one of the big things that we've done. But I don't know if you have other thoughts on this, Aswad, in terms of youth survivors.
Yeah, and I would just add, a key part of what we are doing, like at the Survivor Speak California, we always have a youth track, right, where youth are also participating in that event, being trained in organizing, being trained in advocacy as well, and being trained to tell their story. So a big part of our work is broader, right, but definitely engaging youth and adults and helping train them to become advocates.
That's great. I mean, I do think about young people and who are still developing, affected by trauma, and the self-regulation skills aren't quite what they are as an adult. And it does seem that youth might have some special needs in terms of how to approach them and how to support them. So I think that's on all of us, right? So, well, great. I mean, if there's any other questions from that have come in, or if anyone wants to just go off mute and ask these distinguished panelists questions, please do. Lenore, it looks like you have something to say.
I just wanted to add on to your comment around the differences between serving youth survivors and adult survivors. And I just want to mention that, one of the things, we push against a lot in our advocacy is the idea that the victim services organization has to look or feel a particular way. The reality is a lot of young people are not actually going to come through the front door of a place that says, victim center or, therapy for kids, right? It's just not going to be. So, we look at the wide range of organizations that engage with youth and young adults and disconnected youth and young adults. Vast majority of those organizations are ultimately victim assistance organizations, right? Like even if they do a combination of other things, like they do employment support, the majority of the kids they're working with are exposed to chronic violence, are experiencing chronic trauma, are experiencing the effects of having been a victim themselves. We have to recognize all those organizations as part of the family of victim assistance, right? As part of the community of victim assistance. You don't have to have the word victim in the name, okay? It's about who are you serving and are you helping them heal, okay? And if that is what you're doing, then these sort of traditional supports that come, the traditional public funding sources can and should be available to you. I was just in Cleveland, Ohio last week, and we were with members of the U.S. Department of Justice, and they were touring a trauma recovery center, and the head of the trauma recovery center invited the violence interruption program to come to the site visit. And the question was why, right? Well, because the people that they work with are all victims, right? These are all people who have been disconnected and who have been experienced violence and victimization. And they need to be a part of this, because that's how we can get folks in the door, is by working directly with the organizations that young people gravitate toward. So we need to ask that question: where are young victims? Okay, they're not going to necessarily be where we would think they would if they identified as victims. Let's still get those organizations help.
I love that. I mean, we've had a prior topic on positive youth justice, and just the notion that, young people want opportunities. They want opportunities to be supported, to heal in this case, and that we don't have to call it a victim or survivor center necessarily to do that. So well taken. Again, I invite anyone to speak, to chime in. I think at this point, we want to maybe say now, at this point, we do want to learn from these series. So we're going to probably post a little early SurveyMonkey evaluations, so that you can just have that and maybe take some time before you end the call to actually fill it out, because I know how busy you get. After this call, you'll be on to something else. So we want to make sure that we keep this discussion alive. Again, and if there's any final questions or comments, please put those in the chat. We, again, appreciate the feedback. I think at this point, maybe I can want to first thank our distinguished panelists or guests here, or speakers. Lenore Anderson, Oswald Thomas, thank you so much for telling your stories, and thanks for the good work you've done. I mean, you've really been making a difference nationally. Just covering all the things that have come up is in the past, 5, 6, 7 years is just amazing. So clearly a lot more work to do. With that, I'm going to turn to the director, Lucero, to sort of bring us home.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you to Lenore Anderson. I read your book a while ago, and wow, you're an amazing, your contribution to this field is just amazing, and I want to thank you. Oswald Thomas, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for your contribution to justice for all in the work that you're doing. The information today confirms that our work to build CBO capacity must include CBOs that serve individuals that have been harmed by violence in their communities. You really brought that home, that infrastructure, that community infrastructure that is being impacted and is really in the best place to serve their own neighborhoods. We need to build that. And that is something that OYCR is doing, is committed to doing, and will continue doing. We're also looking at how to use the Medi-Cal reform initiatives of Cal HHS to allow for wellness coaches and community workers and other sustainable funding dollars beyond what currently exists for CBOs to really be game changers and really evolve this area of opportunity. And what Lenore said was that she said, really understand how all of what we are talking about today, what it does, what it has to do with public safety, because it's a myth that that you're either for criminal justice reform or you're for safety from our perspective. It is the opposite, because helping victims, if we center health and healing, that's better for public safety than a 40-year period. And you didn't say what that was, but I think you were referring to that 40-year period of incarceration for that young person. more community, more dignity equals more safety. And then you said, what we need to promote is a right to heal. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that. Those are some words I'm taking away today, is that we need to promote that right to heal for both the harmed and the ones that have harmed, and how often they are the same. I would like to remind you, and thank you for coming, everyone, but I'd like to remind you that our next webinar on April 8th, we will feature Professor Kristen Henning, who is from Georgetown University. She runs a juvenile law clinic there, and she has authored a book, and it's called The Rage of Innocence. And it's how America criminalizes Black youth. And her topic of webinar will be called Race, Adolescence, and the Criminalization of Youth of Color. I'm hoping that you will join us. We really like to bring these provocative topics to you so that we can all learn together, and that we can all be part of the solution together. So with that, I hope you have filled out your survey. Again, thank you to our distinguished panel, and I think that we're done. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.